We are continuing with C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. We are at chapter 3, The Reality of the Law. And he begins with a very interesting statement, and really it's like a précis of what's already gone. Two odd things about the human race, he says. First, that they were haunted by the idea of a sort of behaviour they ought to practice, what you might call fair play. That's English, isn't it?
Yep,
that's very
play.
English. Fair play. Fair play, old chum. Or decency, or morality, or the law of nature. Second, that they did not in fact do so. We're not very good at doing what we think we should be doing, do we?
We have never been good at not doing what we ought to do. We just haven't.
That's right. And he said, people are not perfect, and why on earth should I expect them to be?
Yes, very valid point.
Anything to say on that?
No, just this is just as he continues with that concept of the law of human nature, which we discussed last time round in chapter 2, and arguing that that it is this law, this thing that we ought to do, that dictates what a human actually ought to do. There is this law that sits up there. It's real. It's a binding standard. It isn't just some sort of fluffy, warm feeling. Or some sort of subjective thing. And I think the fact that Lewis puts it out and recognises it as being a universal, consistent across all cultures, all times, and then points to something bigger than the physical universe, because that's what he's nudging towards. Now, he's not going to tell us what that thing is he's pointing to yet. That's not his game. He's laying everything else very nicely. But he's got a wonderful way with words.
He has. He has. Because he's repeating himself again. He says the laws of nature as applied to stones or trees may only mean what nature in fact does, and we just call it something else as we perceive it. If you turn to the law of human nature, the law of decent behaviour is a different matter. That law certainly does not mean what human beings in fact do. He's already said that. Many of them do not obey this law. None of them, not you, Steve, not me, obey it completely. I guess the question then is, what does he mean by that at this stage? He doesn't really say, does he?
No, he doesn't. And I think the point that he makes about stones and trees and all the rest of it, and you say, well, this is the wrong stone or this is the wrong tree. He's saying, well, that's actually not the wrong stone or the wrong tree. It's just how you want to use it. There's nothing wrong with it at all. All you mean is that the stone or the tree doesn't happen to be convenient to you. It's not convenient to you and it doesn't fulfill the purpose of yours. That doesn't make it wrong. It just means it's not convenient to you. I like the way that he does that. I like the way that he takes that.
And of course, a bit of foreshadowing. The law of human nature, he says, tells you what human beings ought to do and do not. With humans, something else comes in above and beyond the actual facts.
This is absolutely right in humanity, isn't it? In terms of just general practice. It's what we see. People everywhere have a sense of what is right and what is wrong, irrespective of what custom they're living in, irrespective of what country they're living in. Underlying principles of fairness, decency, are really similar across the board. The underlying principles. They may be sort of gilded up in different ways, but the underlying principles are there. It's not just an instinctive thing. It can't just be reduced into just instinct, like the survival instinct, because this moral thing will often call us to go against our instincts. I want to run away, that's my instinct, but I ought to go and help. And so rather than run away from the battle, I'll go to it. Rather than run away from the fire, which is what my instinct is telling me to do, I will run into the fire to rescue somebody. That's most inconvenient. It's most inconvenient.
And it's linked to a fact that he says something here that's very powerful. For myself, it's the most powerful thing he's said so far in the book. He says decent conduct does not mean what pays each particular person at a particular moment. It's not a personal thing. It means what pays the human race as a whole. In other words, community. There's a thing that you do, not just for you. It's the idea that hypocrisy is like you doing something because you want to be seen as doing something. You want the fame and the recognition. Now, you don't do it for that. You do it potentially not to be seen, but you're doing it also for the good of others. And that's so powerful. That's wonderful.
It's absolutely fantastic if you live in a society where everybody does actually play fair. And play right.
But they don't.
But they don't. because it goes back to that everyone knows what they ought to do, but they don't do it. So we are intrinsically wired to know what we ought to do within our communities, but so often we don't do it. We go against what we ought to do. Because how does it affect me personally? You know, if it's not going to benefit me personally, why would I flipping do it?
Yes. Do you think it's changed since he wrote this? Its sense of community?
I think individual communities have changed, but I don't think human nature has changed. So I think societal norms have changed, but I don't think humans have changed. We may be living in different societies, but I don't think humanity in that fundamental, we know what we ought to do, has changed. I don't think so.
So if the whole of humanity, everyone on the planet, has this inner sense that there's certain things we should do, and then there's communities, whole nations that don't do it, that sense remains.
I think it does. I think it can be squashed, like the conscience can be squashed. You know, if you can deaden your conscience by continuing to act in a certain way. But I think at your core, you know that you know that you know. Now, whether you act that out and whether you fulfill that moral obligation that you sense, that's a different thing. But I do think that humans understand that there is a certain way to behave, that there is a certain way that we should conduct ourselves, that there are certain things that we should do and should not do. And where do we draw that from? Well, we draw that from this law.
He says this right at the end, doesn't he, of this chapter. There is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behaviour, and yet quite definitely real. A real law, which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us.
If there is a moral law, then it is a clue to something bigger than us, right? And if this law is something that we didn't actually create, but we feel compelled to do, then it must point to a moral authority that has placed that law there that we are wired into. So the way that he's setting this all up is that he is bringing the focus and he's laying the foundation for his argument for the existence of God based on the reality and the universality of this moral law that we are compelled to move towards, whether we squash it or whether we don't, whether we choose to or whether we don't. And that's our choice, right? It's something we're hardwired with, and it goes over and above instinct.
I'm fascinating personally about, let's say, yourself and I. We both believe in God. That's not a question. And I accept that there is definitely laws beyond ourselves we didn't make. We didn't make, like, for instance, gravity. So we know, even the hard-faced atheists who say there is no God, know that there are laws of science that they did not make. We intuit them. We've agreed on a common way of accepting that they exist and the language, blah, blah, blah. But there's also this moral thing. But then they stop, the hard-faced atheists. They don't go any further. Yet on one hand, they're going all the way. But on this one, they don't seem to want to edge towards a common acceptance. And I wonder what puts them off. Is it the word God? Or is it we don't want to give away things from humanity to something that may not be human? What is it, you think, that stops people accepting this?
I think it is very base level. It's pride, that we see ourselves as the pinnacle of all things. And I think that it is, let's call it the sin of pride, which has always elevated humanity to think it is at the apex of everything. And there is nothing above humanity. And therefore we are the be-all and end-all. And for us to actually be willing to consider to bow the knee to a greater power than ourselves, for many people, that is anathema.
It's amazing. I don't know the psychology. I understand it really. I agree with you with the pride and vanity.
I'd imagine it will come out to the superego or something like that. Who did that? Was that
Freud?
Freud. Who was it? Freud. Yeah.
You got the id, ego, and superego.
Id, ego, and the superego. Yeah. So there's got to be something in that would help unpack it.
Do you think we need to explain those terms?
Well, I'll let you explain them, shall I?
So Freud, it gives the tripartite sense of being in us. We've got the reptilian side of the brain, which he calls the id, and it keeps us alive. So, if we're on a desert island starving, we're not going to be thinking about this kind of topic. Food first, then moral, so to speak. The ego develops around about the time of my grandson's age, 5, that he's different to other beings. I actually think it goes much earlier than that. This sense that we're
I
different.
would be inclined to agree with you.
Yeah. And then the ego goes to the superego, and that's your sense of right and wrong, your moral compass, which doesn't fully develop in a lot of people, but it's this higher sense, the higher self, almost like looking down on our actions and saying, no, you shouldn't do that. And it's not because we got like, don't do that, putting your hand in the cookie jar or whatever, because we can extrapolate from that to other things that we've never had experiences with, and that develops over time. And there's always this conflict with, is this right and this is wrong. One of the things of, like, I think if I'm correct, Freud talks about his neuroses that often block certain things, but also, as you say, pride. It serves me to do this now. I don't want to have my stuff taken away from me, but if I had the opportunity to take it from somebody else, should I do that? Is that right and wrong, and so on?
Yeah. And C.S. Lewis goes into that in this chapter. He says, as an explanation of why we feel as we do about right and wrong, it just misses the point. If we ask, why ought I to be unselfish? And you reply, because it's good for society. We may then ask, well, why should I care what's good for society, except when it happens to pay me personally? And then you always have to say, well, because you ought to be unselfish, which simply brings us back to where we started. I think that there is a natural leaning for humanity to move from what I would call the semi-transcendent position that we are in to the transcendent position. And I think that we see that played out in the earliest stories in the mytho-history of Genesis 1 to 11 with the Tower of Babel, where we're looking at the growing, we will reach the stars, we will be like God. And it goes back to the dawns of time with humanity, and it is still heavily ingrained in us.
Well, that's the beauty of studying scripture, is it not? I mean, the ancients knew stuff. They were struggling with this just as much as the modern mind. Well, is there a modern mind? I don't think there is. It's a mind that has always existed. We just know few things more than the ancients did, but they knew a lot more than we do.
And I think that is the position, and that is the humble position that you should hold. You should say, hey, we are far more advanced technologically. We are far more advanced in this area. But what have we lost? How many people do you know that can speak multiple languages, can read in multiple languages, who study the stars, know the course of their transitioning through the skies, who could get on a boat and navigate from this point to this point just using the stars to guide them by? How many people do you know that could walk out into a forest and forage foods which is going to benefit them, which is going to heal them? We've lost so much of that. I mean, that reservoir of knowledge, which was probably a damn sight bigger than it is today, has been reduced to a core group of people who we now label as Fruit Loops and eccentrics and all sorts of other things. So what we've gained on one hand, we've lost on the other. Memory's one of them, isn't it?
Well, I was just about to say that what we have lost, and I don't want to mention the name, but imagine the sound a clock makes. With that world, there's no way you could imagine somebody remembering the whole of the first 5 books of the Torah.
No, of course not.
You just couldn't do it.
Not at all.
And also, if you don't remember, you can't make connections.
No, you can't.
My final point with this chapter is that he says that which we find pressing on us is the last sentence. There's a sense of almost urgency here, isn't there? That a real law we find pressing on us. It's there, pressing. I don't think he means weight, does he? Is he urgency or a sense of its power, or its magnificence? What's he mean?
As I read this, what I envisage is that we are aware of a presence that is gently pushing against us, saying, don't forget, I am here. And so we carry this pressure as opposed to a burden, but it's a pressure that we just know there is something. And there'll be some people that say, no, there's not, that's absolute rubbish. Well, that's their call. But most people on their deathbed or in their dire situations, one of the first things that they cry out for is for God to help them. The God that doesn't exist,
yes.
The God that they don't believe in. Why would you do that?
Exactly.
You're actually tapping into something of spirit that is crying out to spirit, because God is spirit.
Because I think at the very end, your ego and your vanity is no more.
It's all stripped away from you, mate.
It's stripped by that moment,
Totally gone.
And often it's their last thing that they will be thinking. It's like we used to say, we've said it quite often, haven't we? That if you're on your deathbed, you're not going to be thinking, "Oh, if only I'd done one more hour at work," or "If only I'd been a bigger idiot." No, you'll be thinking, well, was I a good person?
What's my legacy?
Oh, that's interesting then, because that's going to make me think now, again, I like the idea of pressing. It's almost like a soft ululation, a feeling, a sensing, ululations of the voice, of course. But if we know that it's there and then we tend not to do it, that pressing, it's like a naggingness, isn't it? It's always there, gently, non-judgmental, waiting. Yeah, interesting point. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's how I would see it.
Sweet. So are we at the end of that chapter now, Steve?
We are indeed. And the next chapter, chapter 4, is what lies behind the law.
That's what I'm interested to read. All right then. Cheers, sir.
Au revoir. Take care, mate. Bye-bye.